Okay, fine. Today we'll be looking at the poem Richard Cory. The poem Richard Cory. This comes under the theme. We have topics when it comes to O level English literature. So, particular poem, Richard Cory. This is the title of the poem, and this is the writer, the poet, by Sir Edwin Arlington Robinson. Richard Cory by Sir Edwin Arlington Robinson. It comes under the topic of society, right? Under the theme of society, right? So, as usual, let's read the poem, and when we look at the poem, just how the poem looks, one, two, three, and four. There are only four stanzas. So, what is the form? A stanza consisting of four lines. A stanza of four lines. We call it a stanza of four lines. Sorry for that. A stanza of four lines. A stanza of four lines. We call it a quatrain. We call it a quatrain. Altogether, we have four quatrains. It makes 16 poetic lines. The total line count of the poem adds up to 16 poetic lines. We have altogether 16 poetic lines in the form of four quatrains. In the form of four quatrains. So let's do the first surface reading of the poem. This is Richard Cory by Sir Edwin Arlington Robinson. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, the people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean, favored, and imperially slim. So it's very difficult not to notice, right, the rhyme scheme. Him, slim, town, crown, right? Now imagine, have you ever heard this expression? Normally we don't say sole to crown, we say head to feet. Head to feet. But what happens if we say something like that? Crown to feet. If feet comes here, then it won't rhyme perfectly. It won't rhyme with town. So in order to make it rhyme, what has Arlington Robinson done? He has changed feet into replaced feet with crown, and he wanted to paint the picture of this the subject Richard Cory in a more majestic way, in a more grand way. So he turned head into, right, head into crown, and feet, right, feet. Right? Did I confuse it? Right? Here he has used sole instead of feet, sole instead of feet, and he has used crown instead of head. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, the people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean, favored, and imperially slim. You read the second stanza, the second quatrain. Read the quatrain. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said good morning, and he glittered when he walked. Third stanza. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In fine, we thought that he was everything to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. Basically, that's the poem Sir Richard Cory by Sir Edwin Arlington Robinson. So this is the poet Edwin Arlington Robinson. Right, the name has three parts. Edwin Arlington Robinson. So the titular character is Richard Cory. So this sort of a title, the title, look at the title. So the title represents the name of the main character. So this sort of a title we call it an eponymous title. An eponymous title. Why? Because the title translates into the main character, name of the main character. Who is the main character here? Richard Cory. Richard Cory is the subject that is being described here in this poem of 4 quatrains. In this poem of 16 lines, Sir Edwin Arlington penned this poem, and the subject is Richard Cory, the titular character, the character in the title. Titular character. I hope you are learning something. So I didn't teach you anything, not yet. So let's dig into the basics, right? Simon and Garfunkel, right? Now, who are Simon and Garfunkel? Now, Simon and Garfunkel are uh, an American folk rock band duo. An American folk rock band duo. Duo means music band consisting of only 2 people. Wrote a song called Richard Cory, released on their 1966 album Sounds of Silence. It's directly inspired by Robinson's poem, but Paul Simon, right? This is Paul Simon, this is Art Garfunkel, made some notable changes. So they have, right, these two, right? They at their school they learned the same poem and they thought of making a song out of it, but they made some notable changes to the character and the story as well. So you can listen to the song on YouTube as well. Richard Cory, the song Richard Cory by Simon and Garfunkel. That is something extra to get yourself familiarized with this poem. So, and now look at this illustration, look at this graphic in order to prime your mind, prepare your mind to the narration, the story that is included in this particular poem, Richard Cory. Okay. Moving on. Now about the author. Name consists of 3 parts. Edwin Arlington Robinson. So this is Sir Edwin Arlington Robinson. Initials spelled here. Edwin Arlington Robinson. So this is Edwin Arlington Robinson's poem, Richard Cory. So something about the author. Edwin Arlington Robinson, 1869 to 1935, 69 to 35, was an American poet from Hittite, Maine, who grew up in the nearby town of Gardiner. Gardiner. So he was basically from this town. The model for his fictional Tilbury town, the setting for many of his best known poems, including Richard Cory. So much of his work, right? Most of his work, most of Edwin Arlington Robinson's works are based on a fictional imaginary town called the Tilbury town. The setting of most of his literary work are based on a fictional town. That is not a real town, something he imagined and created for himself, called the Tilbury town. It is loosely based on his real town, the place where he lived, Gardiner. The setting for many of his best known poems, including Richard Cory. He had a difficult early life. So, this is about his personal life. His life was very difficult. Financial troubles, right? Lots of problems concerning money, finance. A father's decline. A father's decline means, in this case, his father was struggling with serious illnesses. The health of the father was deteriorating, and father was the one who was earning money, and because of the terminal illness, he couldn't earn money for the family. So he was growing in poverty, and the brothers struggle with addiction. And his brother, when it came to his brother was addicted to drugs like morphine, and the brothers struggles with addiction shaped his worldview. So this, all these things happening right around him inside his family, it changed significantly how he looked at the world, how he understood the world. See, there was poverty in the family, and father was sick, and the finances were very tight. That is once again poverty, and there was a addiction going on with his brother. So there were so many problems, right, surrounding his family. He never achieved great commercial success during much of his life. He never achieved great commercial success during much of his life, but was critically respected, eventually winning 3 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry. When it came to writing, as a writer, he won critical acclaim. He even went to collect the accolades, the achievements such as Pulitzer Prize. He is known for tightly crafted, ironic character portraits. So most of his characters are very ironic. So what do you mean by ironic? They are not what they seem. Subjects, his choice of characters, the characters that he developed in his poem, they are not what they seem. They are not what they appear. There's a distinction. There's a difference between appearance and reality. He is known for tightly crafted, ironic character portraits, often of small town New England figures whose outward lives mask inner despair. So, most of his characters, including Richard Cory, right? Most of his character portraits, they are their outward lives, their social lives, how they appear outside. They appear much happier, optimistic outside, but coming to inside, it was not the case. It was entirely different. It was entirely different because their lives were full of despair. That is, they were carrying private pain, hidden pain inside their lives. So outside they seemed happy, but inside they were, right, despair, hopeless, without hope. So that was a brief introduction about Sir Edwin Arlington Robinson, the author of the poem Richard Cory. And next, background. Let's look at the background relevant to the poem. The background relevant to the poem. So I will give you like a few seconds, couple of seconds, just read the background for yourself. Right. Let's continue with the background. Background relevant to the poem. Richard Cory was published in 1897. The poem itself was published in 1897 by Robinson, Mr. Robinson, in Robinson's collection, The Children of the Night. So, it was a part of the collection The Children of the Night, published in 1897. It's part of his Tilbury Town poems, a fictional stand-in for Gardiner, Maine, where Robinson explored the private sorrows hidden behind the public faces of small town citizens. That's going too far. Right here, can you remember, right? Edwin Arlington Robinson, right? He lived where? In a small town called Gardiner. So based on where he lived, he conjured, he created for himself a fictional and imaginary town called Tilbury Town, loosely based on drawing from the real town where he lived, Gardiner. So this is a real location in America, but this is not a real location. This is a fictional town he created, right? In his poems, in his literary work. So once again, so what is the setting of this poem, Richard Cory? The place is Tilbury Town, a fictional place, a fictional stand-in for Gardiner, Maine, where Robinson explored. Explored means he observed. In this case, he observed. He observed the private sorrows hidden behind the public faces of small town citizens. So, even I have this curious habit. I have this curious habit. I can't help it. Whenever I'm riding home, I used to look at the faces of people. Some people, especially when it's evening, right? People, right? Especially those who are working from 8 to 5 p.m., right? At about 5:30, at about 6, they would hurry themselves, right? Down the roads. They want to catch the bus. They want to go straight home, right? So most of their faces, right? Some faces they are like a peeled lemon, a crushed lemon. Some faces, right? I mean, their facial expression, they say, if you look at their faces very earnestly, if you pay attention, if you look at their faces very attentively, right, you can understand that they are carrying some sort of pain, despair, dislike with their life, their routines, their choices, right? And out of the blue, I get to see some really happy faces as well, but mostly that's not the case. So most of the, right, literary critics, the poets, and even literary teachers, teachers of literature, they have this curious habit of what you call peeking into, right, the faces of other people in order to find the emotions they carry, the emotional weight, or even garbage, right? Even garbage they carry inside themselves, right? Because most of us, we judge a book by its cover, but that's not the case. But that people, they may seem happy, they may seem very comfortable, they may seem very thrilled with this life, but inside they carry, wherever they go, they carry their own concerns, their own troubles, their own pain. Richard Cory is no excuse. Richard Cory is no excuse. Where Robinson explored the private sorrows hidden behind the public faces of small town citizens. So, Gardiner, this town was like a lab, like a lab for our poet to experiment, for our poet to experiment, to peek into the, right, to peek into the souls of other people, right? The late 19th century in America, so this is 19th century in America, was a period of stark class divides. So there were Stark means very clear cut class divides. We had lower working class, we had upper class, industrial wealth versus working class poverty. So during this time, 19th century, there was a movement called Industrial Revolution. Have you heard? Industrial Revolution. So this is even explained in Charles Dickens' novel Great Expectations. Great Expectations. Before 19th century, that is 18th century, if you were born poor to poor parents, then you are lower class. You will never have a chance to climb up the social ladder and become upper class. If you are born to a right, born to poor lower class parents, then you will you didn't have any choice. You had to die as a lower class citizen. But after 19th century industrial revolution, everything changed. That is, business sector started booming. There was a significant growth in industries, businesses. So everyone did one thing or another. They started businesses, right? Small scale businesses, they scaled it up to large scale, right? And they earned money, right? So once they had money, that is wealth, they bought good clothes and they could afford good education. Having these three changed the game. That is, if you had money, good clothes, and good education, you could easily climb up the social ladder from lower class to upper class. Before 19th century, there is no such way. But after 19th century, right, because of the industrial revolution, because of the growth of the huge expansion of industries, right, lower class people, they could afford money, and when they became wealthier enough, they could afford expensive clothes and expensive education. That drastically, right, that changed the lower class social position to upper class. That was a social upgrade. The late 19th century in America was a period of stark right. So it was all about social classes, upper class and lower class. Industrial wealth versus working class poverty. Right? Some people, right, by involving themselves in the industry, they accumulated wealth. Right? They became wealthy. But some people still, they kept on working and remaining poor, working class, lower class people. And Robinson often used this economic contrast as a lens for. So there is an economic contrast. We have upper class people and lower working class poor people. Right. And Robinson, the poet, often used this economic contrast as a lens for psychological and existential themes. So what is this? What are existential themes? Existential themes are simply questions about basic conditions of human existence. Themes are related to basic conditions of human existence. Like, does our lives, right, now imagine, right, do our lives have a purpose, right? Do our lives have a meaning? If our lives, they don't have a meaning, should we create a meaning? What is the purpose of this life? Such questions we call existential questions, right? Existential questions. So hope you are following, right? Robinson often used this economic contrast as a lens for psychological and existential themes. Why? Now, some people, they are upper class, some people, they are lower class, meaning there are wealthy people who can afford good food, and there are poor people who cannot afford good food. People whose living condition is very favorable, very comfortable, and people whose living conditions are below average, right? Not that comfortable, right? Not that very basic, very basic. So it led Robinson to think or ponder, do our lives have a meaning, or do we create a meaning for our lives? Because when we look at the society, some they are rich, some they are poor, some they have plenty of food, some they have nothing to eat. So there was right a huge disparity, a difference between people. Importantly, the poem was written decades before terms like clinical depression, like existed in public consciousness. So this is a time when the medicine, the science, medicine was not that advanced, the psychology was not that advanced, and they have not come up with terms like clinical depression. Clinical depression means long-term sadness. Some people, when they are sad for continuously for 2-3 weeks, we can describe him as being affected by clinical depression. So this is a time, 19th century, it was a time, right, decades before, right, the medicine, the science was, the psychology was not that improved. They had not studied and discovered such depressive states, right, mental states. Was written decades before terms like clinical expression existed in public consciousness. That is public awareness. People didn't know things like clinical depression, right? There were no terms to define such conditions. Robinson is tapping into an intuitive, that is based on feeling. So like 10-20 years before clinical depression was introduced, our poet had a by feeling, he had a gut feeling by observing the society, right? He already described this clinical depression in his poems, right? Observational truth about suffering rather than a diagnosis. So he's not doing a diagnosis like a doctor. He's not going to treat a patient. He's not uh, trying to find the cures or the reasons, right? But instead, what is he doing? Observational truth about suffering. So by just looking at the society, as a poet, by observing people of different, right, classes, different positions, states, right, he came to know about their suffering, the truth behind their suffering. In Richard Cory, the existential angle is this: Cory has everything. Now, this particular character here, Richard Cory, Cory has everything society says should make a life meaningful. So Cory has everything according to the public consciousness, according to the perspective of the townspeople. So what was the name of the town once again? The fictional town. What was the name of the fictional town? Tilbury town. According to the townspeople of Tilbury, according to their collective consciousness, right? According to their understanding, Cory had everything. Cory had everything that would make a life meaningful. Wealth, money. Would life, would money, would wealth make your life meaningful? That is up to you. Admiration, grace. Grace means what? Here, grace is not defined here in the sense of religion. In the sense of religion, grace means divine favor, favor of God, support of God, blessings of God. But here, grace means refined manners, right? Refined manner, social polish, refined manner. That is, you have the proper etiquettes, you know the standard social behavior, you have the grace, that is, the grace is the standard social behavior that makes you polite and attractive to others. Social police, it would go by the term social police as well. And yet none of it protects him from an inner void. But still, Richard Cory felt empty. Void means empty inside. He seemed to have everything outside. He seemed to have everything outside, but yet, according to townspeople, the townspeople, they thought Richard Cory had everything outside, but according to the person, Richard Cory himself, he was empty inside. That's why we are judging people every day. We are making the same mistake. We are judging people by how they look outside. We never pause or care to consider what they are or not carrying inside, the emotional weight, the despair, the sadness, the sorrow, the suffering, right? Even the clinical depression, right? They might be, right? So they might be a victim of clinical depression, right? So our character Richard Cory, I'm not trying to spoil the narration. This is a narrative poem. Narrative poem. What is a narrative poem? Narrative poem is a poem telling us a story. Narrative poem. So this is a poem telling us a story. The story of Richard Cory. He, according to the townspeople of Tilbury, he appeared to have everything: wealth, admiration, grace, everything. But his from his side, from his own personal perspective, his private life, he had nothing except pain. His life was painful. Right. The poem suggests that external success can't answer the deeper question of whether a life feels meaningful or bearable from the inside. So, according to the poem, right, external success, you can't equate material things, things of the outside world like money, admiration, grace. You can't, right? The respect you get from people, the praise you get from people, the amount of money you have, your social position, right? Your economic status, you can't equate them with with a life's meaning, right? Life doesn't become meaningful because of those external factors, right? No, because Richard Cory had all those, but still his life was unbearable from inside. Inside, he was full of despair. His life was very hopeless. That's what makes it existential rather than just a social commentary about rich versus poor. So, this is not just a social commentary, a poem commenting on the gap between rich and poor. This is not just a poem talking about a social problem. There are rich people, there are poor people. No, more than that, this is existential. Existential regarding the meaning of life. The outward appearance, the clothes you wear, the amount of money you have, your social position in the society, right? All those things are external, and external things don't make your life any more meaningful. Meaning cannot be found in those external criteria, right? It's pointing at a problem no amount of money or success can solve. Here, the problem Richard Cory had, no amount of money could solve his problem, not even his social status. Here, look at this graphic illustration. When Richard Cory would right visit the town, here try to get the idea. When Richard Cory would visit the town, everybody in the town would flock around him just to talk to him, just to touch him, just to feel him, just to smile at him, just to get some attention from him, because everyone thought Richard Cory was the ideal man. He was the perfect man. He had everything. He had money, he had good clothes, he had good education, he had good social polish, he had good looks, he was handsome, he had everything. Everyone thought he was the ideal, the perfect human. The perfect human. Everyone envied him. Envy translates closely to jealousy. Everyone wanted, desired to be like him. Desired. Everyone thought Richard Cory was so perfect. So perfect. Everyone thought Richard Cory embodied perfection. Perfection. So everyone wanted to be like Richard Cory. So whenever he would visit the town, whenever he went through the town, it was like he was the center of attraction. People, they never looked at him like an ordinary human being. According to them, he was something more than a human being. They even said he shined. He shined brightly when he walked. That is hyperbole. Hyperbole. Hyperbole means exaggeration. They attach more meaning than it was the real case when it came to Richard Cory. So we didn't go through the poem yet, right? We are doing the background work. Now let's look at the genre of the poem. So what is the genre of the poem? Genre means the style of the poem. When it comes to a play or a drama, there is a genre. What's the genre? It may be a tragedy, it may be a comedy, it may be a tragic comedy. If it is sad, if it has a sad ending, it's a tragedy. If it ends in a happy note, right, it's a comedy. If it mixes both the elements of sadness and happiness, we call it a tragic comedy. But here we don't have a play or a drama. Here what we are looking at is a poem. This is a narrative telling us a story, lyric poem. This is a narrative lyric poem. So lyric means related to the rhyme scheme. So it has a sing song quality, much like a nursery rhyme, right? The nursery rhymes, row your boat gently down the stream, right? Something that can be lulled, something that can be sung. This is a narrative lyric poem, specifically a form of dramatic irony narrative poem. So what is dramatic irony? Now we know what is irony, right? Irony is the difference between what we expect and what we get in reality. The difference between expectation and reality. That is irony. That is things are not what they seem to be. Here Richard Cory, he seems to be something, but in reality he is something else. Something else, something different. Okay, that is the difference between appearance versus reality. Now when it comes to irony, there are three types of irony, right? Three types of irony. One is verbal irony, the second one is situational irony, the third one is dramatic irony. So now we have come across dramatic irony, specifically a form of dramatic irony narrative poem. So what is dramatic irony? Dramatic irony means The main character doesn't know, but the reader knows. Now, now we know the problem with Richard Cory, but Richard Cory doesn't understand the problem that is, right? The problem surrounding him, the problem concerning him. So, such an irony is called dramatic irony. When the character fails to figure out his problem, dramatic irony, narrative poem. So, dramatic means irony found in dramas. So, here, even though this is not a drama, we have dramatic irony in this particular narrative poem. Specifically, a form of dramatic irony narrative poem. It tells a story, narrative, but through the compressed musical language of lyric verse. So, a story is being told in a very compressed, in a very short manner, but in a very musical way, lyrical way. It also belongs to the tradition of the character sketch poem. So, this once again, talking about the style, genre, this is a character sketch poem. The poem is sketching a character. The poem is describing us the character of Richard Cory throughout the four quatrains. And its shocking ending places it in the poem ends in a very shocking way, very devastating way. Ends in a very gloomy, very upset way. It upsets us. And its shocking ending places it in the lineage of poems built around a twist or reversal, build up of admiration, then the sudden reveal. So there is a twist. Things change. Things take a turn to the verse when it comes to this poem, right? The imagine how many lines there are? There are altogether 16 lines. Mostly the first three quatrains, it builds up admiration. It says everything that is so positive, so good and so beautiful about Richard Cory. But when it comes to the final stanza, the final quatrain, there is a reversal, there is a twist. That is the admiration that was built up so far, it takes, it pivots, it changes the direction. It changes the direction. So I don't want to spoil the story, so I won't be explaining the ending. It's not the time. A character sketch. So what is a character sketch? A character sketch poem. A character sketch poem is a poem whose main purpose is to portray a single person. So it focuses on a single person, the notion. That means center of attraction. Wherever he walked, people flocked just to talk to him. And when he talked, their hearts skipped a beat. And they thought he was not an average human. He was far more than a human, a superhuman maybe. Rather than to tell a complex plot or explore the poet's own feelings directly. So a character sketch is a poem describing the appearance, manner, personality, or even the place a person had in a specific community. Rather than to tell a complex plot or explore the poet's own feelings directly. So it's not about telling a complex story. In fact, here it's not that complex. Often, continuing on, we are continuing the definition of a character sketch poem. Often there's a point or reveal behind the portrait. Point or reveal. That is a reversal of events, a plot twist. Things change, pivot. The direction changes suddenly. The poet isn't just describing someone for description's sake. So there is a purpose behind describing Richard Cory, but using that character to make a larger observation. Once again, come across the word observation. Observation about society, human nature, irony, etc. So, what is a character sketch poem? The the writer would describe about a single person. Single person. Why is he describing? What is the purpose behind the description of that person? To reveal to reveal something fascinating about the society or human nature. To reveal something about the human nature, right? That is, the poet is using this person as an observation, as an observation to reveal something fascinating about human nature. So, what is fascinating about the human nature? People, they they appear something outside, but inside they are 99% of the case they are not the person they appear outside. They are totally different. They are totally different people inside. The inside man is very different from the outward appearance. The outward appearance. Richard Cory, everything seemed very fine. Everything seemed more than fine, super fine when it came to Richard Cory. But that is just judging by outward appearance. There are there is more to the eye meets. That is, our perspective is very limited. Limited. Our perspective is very limited. If we are going to judge a person by just looking at him physically, then we are going to miss 90% of him, because we are only looking at what is visible to the naked human eye. Choice of subject, and what about the subject and what about the theme? Now, what is subject? Subject is the topic or the person or the thing that is being described. And what is the theme? Theme is the message of the writer, the author. Robinson deliberately chooses a subject who seems to have everything. Now, Richard Cory is the subject. He seems to have everything. Here, wealth is included, grace is included, charm is included, elegance, social polish is included, but happiness is not included, peace is not included. See, people, right? The average people, the townspeople, right? They have attached external things. They have listed external things. They have named, listed external things as things that would make our lives meaningful. But that's not essentially the case. But that's not the case. Robinson deliberately chooses a subject who seems to have everything: wealth, grace, charm, elegance. This is a calculated choice. Calculated means this is a calculated choice. This is something he is doing deliberately, on purpose, by making Richard Cory as enviable as possible, because he wanted to make Richard Cory enviable. He wanted to make Richard Cory the subject of the townspeople's jealousy. Right? He wanted to make Richard Cory as desirable as possible in the eyes of poor working townspeople. By making Richard Cory as enviable as possible, Robinson maximizes the shock and irony of the ending. So, the first three quatrains, they develop admiration, they build admiration toward Richard Cory. And the final stanza, there is a reversal of events. There is a reversal of events. There is a plot twist. Everything changes abruptly, suddenly. The poem isn't really about a rich man. See, we are missing the case. We are missing the point here. The poem isn't really about a rich man. It's about the gap between appearance and inner reality. There's a gap between appearance, how people look like, and inner reality, and how they feel inside. See, you can drive a luxury vehicle, right? You can have all the expensive clothes. You can afford expensive foreign education, but it doesn't mean you are happy inside, because all those things are outside. And about how outsiders project their own longing onto someone they don't actually know. The poem isn't really about a rich man, it's about the gap between appearance and inner reality. About how outsiders project their own longing onto someone they don't actually know. No. Now, this is very meaningful. How outsiders, now outsiders, imagine we are outsiders, we tend to attach we tend to label people based on our own desires. Now we don't have, now imagine if you don't have money, and if you wish to have more money and become wealthy, whenever you see someone dressed well, dressed in a very fancy way, you would think of him, you would consider him as a wealthy person, as a rich guy. That is, we are attaching labels people to people whom we don't know very well. We are attaching labels to people whom we don't know at a personal, meaningful level. So, that is, the townspeople, they never knew Richard Cory personally enough. But still, they went to describe Richard Cory as wealthy, a man of social polish, a man with good education. Why? They only concern what they saw from their physical eyes. They were limited to that physical, that external information. So, about how outsiders project their own longing onto someone they don't actually know. So, they labeled Richard Cory according to how they felt, according to their own desires, according to their own unfulfilled desires, unfulfilled ambitions. Now imagine the townspeople, they were poor. Poor means they wanted to become wealthy. So when they looked at Richard Cory wearing fancy clothes, walking through the town, they immediately labeled him as wealthier than a king, wealthier than a king. So that's their mind working, how their mind worked, how the average human mind works. So coming to the form and the structure. So before that we will look at this illustration. Now when you look at this illustration, you can divide this into two parts. This is how townspeople saw Richard Cory as a public figure. As a public figure. This is what the level of information that was available to their eyes, naked eyes. But this is what they did not understand. His private life, his personal pain, That is, all these people, the Tilbury Town's people, they never knew Richard Cory at a personal level enough to understand his personal pain, the problems he was going through. So this aspect of his life was hidden from the public, right? They only saw him as a celebrity, like an actor, a Hollywood or Bollywood actor, right? Now, how many actors do we know? We know so many actors and even actresses. We know so many models. We even know politicians. Not because we have personal connections with them, but just because we are exposed to social media, we get to see them through mass media, on TV, on radio, via internet, on YouTube, likewise. That is, so we should stop judging people based on how they look. Based on how they look. Because how they look is always different, is totally different from how they would feel about themselves. Right? So form versus structure. Once again, what is form? Form is the shape. Form means the shape of the poem. Structure means how the ideas are contained in the stanzas, how the ideas are organized. First comes this idea, next this idea. That is how the ideas are ordered, how the ideas are organized. Structure means how the ideas are organized. Form means the technical shape of the poem. For instance, here we have quatrains. How the poem looks and feels. How the poem looks, here we have quatrains. And how the poem looks and how the poem sounds. Sounds means what? The rhyme scheme. So, when we are commenting on the form of the poem, we can comment about quatrains, and then we can comment about the rhyme scheme of the poem. Right. Form. The poem is written as 4 quatrains, 4 line stanzas, a classic and tidy form, fitting for a poem about a man who appears perfectly composed and orderly. Now, regarding the form, it has 4 quatrains. 4 quatrains. Very clean, very tidy, very neat. Why? So the form matches what is being described. That is the subject or the content. Who is the subject? Richard Cory. Even our subject is very tidy, very neat. So the form matches the subject. A matching form is used to describe a subject. So an appropriate form is being used here. And when it comes to the structure, the narrative structure. So mind I tell you, this is a narrative poem. What is a narrative poem? A narrative poem is a poem telling us a story. The narrative structure builds steadily, systematically, steadily. There is a steady pace. Narrative structure builds steadily 3 stanzas of admiration and description. So we have quatrain 1, 2, 3, all functioning as description, all functioning as admiration or descriptions of Richard Cory, escalating in praise, all praising Richard Cory, followed by a final 4th stanza that pivots sharply. So the plot twist, the reversal of events is found in the last stanza. You find the plot twist in the last stanza. The first three stanzas are town's perspective on Cory. So, the first three stanzas, it deals with how the townspeople, it deals with how the townspeople, they praise Richard Cory, how they admire Richard Cory, how they look at Richard Cory, how they label Richard Cory based on their envy, based on their desire, based on their jealousy. That is, the townspeople, they are allowing their jealousy or their own lack to define Richard Cory than getting to know Richard Cory as a person at a very meaningful level, at a very personal level, and understanding his real life, down to earth, practical life, factually. So, everything that the people would go on saying, they are not facts. They are what they think, their own personal biases, personal opinions. Personal opinions. The first three stanzas are the town's perspective on Cory. The last stanza shifts from admiration to consequence. We have the plot twist or the reversal of events. Ending in the abrupt, it ends suddenly. Collapses everything like this. Ending in the abrupt, brutal fine line. Final line. The final line is an unbearable blow. It's very devastating. This structural imbalance, there is an imbalance because it ends all of a sudden, all of a sudden, out of nowhere it ends. Have you seen people plugged into a machine, and from the machine we get to see their heartbeat, and at once their heartbeat flatlines? Here also the same thing. Quatrain 1, Quatrain 2, Quatrain 3. It's everything is working well in favor of Richard Cory. He is living, right? Everyone is praising him, admiring, and all of a sudden, when it comes to 4, everything reverses. This structural imbalance, 3 stanzas of build up, 1 line of devastation, mirrors real trauma. Long calm, then sudden rupture. So this is how clinical depression works. You may have seen people, right? They appear to be very calm. They appear to be okay. They appear to be very silent for 1, 2, 3 weeks straight. Then all of a sudden, they take their lives. They do something very devastating, something harmful to themselves. They cause self-harm. That is clinical depression works. So it's difficult to say whether how a person is feeling inside without getting to know them, without observing. Here, mind you, the word is observation. Observing means without studying them at a very meaningful, deep, personal level, without getting to know them for a long term. So, just by looking at people, you would say he is healthy, he is wealthy, he is engaged, she is married. Just by looking at people, how could you say such things? Right? You cannot say such things, right? We can form personal opinions, but they differ from the real facts. Just by looking at Richard Cory for 2 weeks outside in the town, he would appear very calm, but it might be a symptom of depression. Depressed people, they remain sad for like 2 weeks straight, and the next day, the next week, they do self harm for themselves. So the poem is teaching us something about depression, something about judging people based on external looks. So these are the mistakes we should avoid. And when it comes to rhyme scheme and its purpose, so what's the rhyme scheme and what's the purpose of the rhyme scheme? Take a few seconds, just read it carefully and try to understand without me having to explain it to you. Read this carefully. Right. Rhyme scheme and its purpose. Rhyme scheme and its purpose. The poem follows an A B rhyme scheme in each quatrain. Example: town, crown, him, slim. Technically A B with slant variations written in fair regular iambic pentameter. So this is about the meter, right? Meter. The meter is the rhythm. Rhythm is different from rhyme scheme. So this is the rhyme scheme. This is the rhythm, right? So I will devote some extra time to teach you the rhythm or the meter, right, concerning the iams, right, the syllables. But for now, we will stay with the rhyme scheme, right? Purpose. The steady, it is very steady, right? Always A B A B A B A B A B A B A B A B. It doesn't change. It is very systematic. It is gradual. It doesn't change. So what's the purpose? The steady song like rhyme scheme. The rhyme creates a tone of elegance and control. It creates a tone of elegance, a tone of control, mirroring, showing Richard Cory's polished exterior. So every day when Richard Cory would come to the town, people would think, wow. The people would think of him the same way. Wow, he is wealthy. Wow, he is handsome. Wow, he appears to be very happy. Wow, he appears to be on top of this world. Wow, he appears to be outside of this world. Wow, he appears to be a superhuman, something like that. That is their attitude, their personal bias, their personal opinions. They remain the same because they were judging by their outward appearance of Richard Cory. The regularity lulls the reader into comfort. So this regularity lulls like a lullaby, right? Lulls the reader into comfort, much like the townspeople are lulled by Cory's grace. That is, they are maintaining the same attitude toward Richard Cory. So it is well matched by, it is well explained by the rhyme scheme that does not change. The rhyme scheme is steady, and that likewise the townspeople attitude toward Richard Cory is same. It doesn't change. This makes the final line's violence even more jarring. So this is what makes the plot twist, the reversal of events, more unbearable, more violent. Why? Because everything up to this point was very perfect, very peaceful. The meter doesn't break, but the content shatters the mood entirely. Here, the skin doesn't change, but the content changes suddenly. That is, that is, the appearance doesn't change, but the reality changes. Richard Cory's appearance didn't change, but inside as a person he had changed, and the people failed to see at it, look at it, and the townspeople failed to recognize it, because we are so much focused on the outside and not the inside. Likewise, the same with the form of the poem. The outside does not change, the rhyme scheme does not change, but the content, all of a sudden it changes. All of a sudden it changes. This makes the final line's violence even more jarring. The meter doesn't break, but the content shatters the mood entirely. The form stays composed. There is a very calm, the form is very calm, even as the subject falls apart, which is in miniature the whole point of the poem. Even the subject, that is Richard Cory, right, causes self harm to him, it is not reflected. Now the subject changes toward the end, but the rhyme scheme doesn't change. That is, people's attitude did not change, people's opinion, right? People, just by looking at the outside person, the outward appearance of Richard Cory, could not understand what was really going on inside him. They were so used to seeing him, his outward appearance, they always missed what was going inside of him. They never noticed that he was so depressed inside. He had been so depressed inside. The narrator's envy does get corrected by learning the truth. The narrator's envy does get corrected by learning the truth. So who is the narrator? We. We means the public consciousness, the townspeople, the townspeople. There is a collective narrator called we. That's the townspeople. They are the townspeople. The narrator's envy, right? Envy means desiring something you don't have, but someone else already has. The narrator's envy does not get corrected by learning the truth. Not here, sorry. Correction. The narrator's envy does get corrected by learning the truth. After learning the truth, what's the truth? That Richard Cory took his own life. The narrators, right? They understood their mistake. We were very quick to judge a person by his appearance. They thought if they had all the money Richard Cory had, if they had the education Richard Cory had, if they had the good looks Richard Cory had, if they had the expensive clothes Richard Cory, even their lives would be meaningful. But after learning that Richard Cory committed suicide, now they understood, right? Now they understood that no amount of money can make you happy or make your life meaningful. He had all those things, but his life was not meaningful. Instead, his life was all the while miserable. The poem doesn't show the townspeople's reaction after the death. It ends right at the reveal. The last line is the shock itself with no aftermath shown. So, after the after Richard Cory's death is described in the poem, we don't get to see the townspeople reaction. That is, what's the normal reaction? That they would correct their mistake. What's their mistake? They judged a book by its cover. They judged a person called Richard Cory based on his outward appearance, based on their own personal opinions. That was a grave mistake. So the public reaction, it might have been something like this, but it is never mentioned in the poem because the attention is not about the public reaction. The message is about the mistake. What was the mistake? Judging a person by how they looked. Now coming to themes. Theme 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 themes. Appearance versus reality, the danger of envy and projection, wealth does not equal happiness, the isolation behind a public mask, and finally the hidden suffering of others. So why don't you take time to read through themes 1 through 3. Okay, I will make it more simpler, right? Because it requires a significant attention span. So limit yourself to reading theme number 1. Try to figure out the meaning of theme 1. Try to understand it. Okay, fine. Theme number 1, appearance versus reality. The entire poem is built on the contrast between how Cory looks and what he's actually feeling. Now, Cory looked, how did he look? Based on his looks, the townspeople went on to admire him, went on to praise him from quatrain 1 through 3. They would continue ushering praises, admiring how he walked, how he looked. Wow. They would never stop. The praises kept on flowing non-stop. The entire poem is built on the contrast between how Cory looks. They thought he had good education, he was very handsome, he had all the social polish, and what he's actually feeling. They never paused to understand how he was feeling. He was a guy who was clinically depressed. He had been suffering for 2+ weeks. There was ongoing pain, sorrow, suffering inside him. And coming to week number 3, his pain, Richard Cory's pain, internal pain climax. He could no longer, it was unbearable inside. He could no longer bear it, retain that pain inside. So, in a whim, he took his life. So, this is not something alien. This is not something extraordinary. Haven't you heard of such incidents? This is nothing extraordinary. This is how human nature works. When you get overwhelmed by feelings that you can neither release nor handle, then people think the most sane reaction is causing self harm, taking your own life. But that's not rational, right? Mind you. The townspeople see only the surface. He was described as a gentleman from sole to crown, from feet to the head. They, according to them, according to the townspeople, they thought of him as a gentleman. That is, every inch of him was so gentle, was so sophisticated, was so graceful. Right? For instance, when it comes to us, we would normally label someone, wow, he's a gentleman. We wouldn't go on to labeling someone as a gentleman from sole to crown, from feet to head. That is, every inch of him, every single inch of him was so graceful, was so socially polished, was so socially refined. That is too much hyperbole. They might be exaggerating things, adding too much importance. A gentleman from sole to crown, and someone who glittered when he walked. My goodness. Now, according to the people, they are exaggerating things, attaching things that go beyond the reality. Glittered means shine. According to the townspeople, right, when he walked, he would shine as if there was a halo surrounding him. A halo. Nothing in the poem hints at inner pain. Here, nothing in the poem suggests that he is feeling depressed inside. That's the point. Why? What is the poem? The poem is being narrated. Narrated. According to whose point of view? According to the point of view of townspeople. So, how are the townspeople describing Richard Cory? Based on how they see from their human eyes, naked eyes. You can't see the pain, the emotional weight, the hurt a person carries just by looking, using your physical eyes. No, you can't. You need to get to know him, understand him, associate him for a while, talk to him. No, the people did not get to associate him at a personal level. They would observe him from afar and just make all those statements, all those praises without any personal knowledge about the character Richard Cory. Nothing in the poem hints at inner pain. That's the point. The outside gives no clues. If you focus on the outward appearance, you miss everything that is happening inside. So, theme 1, appearance versus reality. Theme number 2, this is the second message Sir Edwin Arlington Robinson gives us. The danger of envy and projection. Envy is you desire things that other people have and you don't happen to have. You desire, you want to have the things other people have and you don't have. See, that is called envy. That is called you being envious. The danger of envy and projection. The working class narrators. Who are the working class narrators? The townspeople. What is the town? The town of Tilbury. The Tilbury town. A fictional town. The working class narrators don't know Cory personally. That's the problem. They don't know Richard Cory as a person, as a human. They don't know Richard Cory as a human, as a person. They never got to get to know of Richard Cory as an individual human being. Instead, why? If they got to know Richard Cory as a person, would they make such glamorous claims as this guy would shine when he walked? When he's walking, he's shining, he's glittery. Why are they making such claims? Because they never got to know Richard Cory as a person by way of associating him, by way of getting to know him, by way of having a meaningful interaction with Richard Cory. No, they never got to know of him as a person. That's why when described Richard Cory, they described Richard Cory in the sense that he were a superhuman or someone more than a human, someone who was extraordinary. Right? They described him in hyperbolic language, in exaggerated language. They project happiness onto him because of his wealth and manners. So they actually the person Richard Cory as a person was not happy with his life, but the outsiders, the townspeople, they described him as a happy person because people like you and me, ordinary people like you and me, we attach happiness to wealth, we attach to money, we attach happiness to social position. So happiness is not defined by wealth or social position. So that means the more money you have, the more happier you will become. No. The more money you will have, the more nervous, the more anxious you will become. So don't equate happiness to external material objects. That was never the case, and that is never the case. That is never the premise. This is captured in the line to make us wish that we were in his place. So people thought because he had so much money, he was definitely happy, and all the people, they wished, the townspeople, they wished to be in his place, to be in his social position, and to be as wealthy as him, because they equated social position and money with happiness. They thought money and social position equated to happiness. No, that is never ever the case. Their envy is built entirely on assumption. That is, they are forming assumption. They are guessing. That is guesswork, pure guesswork. They are guessing. They are suspecting. They are assuming things that are not real. Right? Their envy is built entirely on assumption, not on any real understanding of who he is. So they are just making assumptions without any proper real understanding. Theme 3, wealth does not equal happiness. So I don't think there is anything new for me to explain regarding this. Go through it. Wealth does not equal happiness. Robinson deliberately piles on markers of privilege. Markers of privilege. Richer than a king. Markers means labels. Privilege means a special advantage that you have based on your social position or because you are rich. Now imagine, just because you are rich, the law the law would not work on you as if you were a normal person, ordinary person. If you are very rich, if you belong to a higher upper class social position, sometimes you might be unaffected by the law. Isn't it the case? Now imagine the president of Sri Lanka. Law doesn't affect him. He is not affected by the law. Why? He is the one who creates the law. That's the thing. So Robinson deliberately piles on. He adds more labels, more descriptions of privilege. Right? In the poem, it is described Richard Cory was richer than a king. Hyperbole, more exaggeration. Admirably schooled in every grace. That is, he had social polish. Only to undercut. That is, he had every social polish. Only to undercut. Undercut means damage. Only to damage them completely with the final act. But within the final stanza, at the final stanza, everything, all the admiration, the praise, all the build up of the character is being suddenly destroyed. Suddenly destroyed. That is, that we call a plot twist. A twist. That we call a reversal of events. A reversal of events. With the final act. The poem argues that material and social success. Material means money or wealth. Money, that is wealth. Synonymous with wealth. Social success means your social position, your social class. Right? Even when it comes to Sri Lanka, right, aren't we so much interested in race, the caste? In Sri Lanka, we have agro-based Buddhist. It translates to Bodhu Govi, something like that. We have the caste system. We are so much concerned about the caste system. We are so much concerned about the social class, the social position, many things. But actually, they are not meaningful. According to the poet, they are not meaningful. They don't add ounce of meaning to our lives. They don't make our lives more meaningful or less meaningful. In fact, they mean nothing. They are meaningless. They are meaningless. And social success, material and social, the poem argues that material and social success can coexist with, even mask deep unhappiness. So, even though you are wealthy, even though you belong to a higher social class, you can feel deeply unhappy. That is the internal, see, the internal unhappiness of a person can be masked, can be hidden by his money and social position. Right? That is, here money and social position, money and power, money and influence can be used to hide the internal pain of a person. Some people, some rich people, when they feel unhappy, how would they try to, what would they do to make themselves better? They would go somewhere, spend a lot of money, right? That is, by doing all such things, they won't be more happier, but instead, people, people, some rich people, they use money and influence to to hide their unhappiness, to hide the unhappiness they are feeling inside. That is, wealth and social success can become masks. They are very deceptive. So don't be misguided by looking at the wealth of a person, by looking at the social position, social class of a person, right? Because they don't define how the person feels inside. If you focus on the outside, you miss the person who is inside. Appearance versus reality. Theme number 4, isolation behind a public mask. Cory is always seen from distance. This man is really isolated, living all by himself. He has no meaningful interaction, relationships in his own life. We people on the pavement looked at him. So the townspeople, they are not emotionally connecting with him. When he would step outside, they would flock to see him as if he were a exhibit, as if he were a exhibit, right? An item, right? As if he were an idol or an item exhibited at a museum, as if he was something to be looked at. Cory is always seen from a distance. We people on the pavement looked at him. People, what? They looked. They never emotionally engaged, involved themselves with Richard Cory. They never get to relate to Richard Cory at a humane level, at a very personal level, at a very meaningful level. No one forged a meaningful human interaction with Richard Cory. He is observed. He is observed. He is observed. He is admired, but never known. That is, no one got to know Richard Cory as a human being. No one got to know Richard Cory as a human being. That is a very powerful statement. That is the same thing when it comes to our lives. Sometimes we never give time to understand another person as a human being. As a human being, we would think just because he has lots of money, just because he rides this sort of a vehicle, just because he lives in a two-story apartment, he is always happy. That's not the case. That's not the premise. That distance is that distance is itself part of the tragedy. That distance. What's the distance? Richard Cory has no one to relate to, no relationships. That distance is itself part of the tragedy. No one gets close enough to see what's happening beneath the composed exterior. Outside, he is very calm, he is very peaceful, he is very gently, he is the nicest person on planet Earth. But inside that mask, what is the mask? The wealth is a mask. The social position is a mask. So beneath that mask, inside that mask, the person inside is very sad, very depressed. So no one got to know of that. The townspeople, they did not get to know of that because they never knew Richard Cory as a person. They never had a meaningful relationship at a very personal level, at a very human level. From their core. That's the reason. So look at the illustration. Look at the illustration. So imagine if Richard Cory would walk in the public wearing a mask, covering his face, then it would be difficult for the people to make such claims that he was a gentleman, that he had social police, because he is covering, right? They never understood the folly. Folly means the foolishness. What do you mean by folly? Folly is the foolishness of making comments making remarks based on outward appearance. Outward appearances, they change. Theme number 5, this would be the last theme. Right, why don't you read it for yourself? Theme number 5. Right. Theme 5, the hidden suffering of others. The hidden suffering of others and the suffering of the poor too. The hidden, what? The hidden suffering of others and the suffering of the poor too. We know Cory had been suffering inside. And what about the suffering of the other? Poor means the working class townspeople. Okay, let's dig into this theme. The poem doesn't only critique assumptions about the rich. So the poem itself is not limited to being a criticism of the rich. Now, it's not only critiquing the assumptions targeting the rich people. It also shows real hardship in the townspeople's own life. So one mistake is making false assumptions about rich people. Though they look rich inside, outside, they might be poor inside. Being here looking rich outside does not necessarily guarantee that he or she is always rich inside. Okay? It also shows real hardship. The townspeople's own lives. In the townspeople's own lives, the working class townspeople, they are struggling in poverty. So on we worked and waited and went without the meat and cursed the bread. So on we worked. The working class people's lives, it was right. It was defined by ongoing work. They had to work every day tirelessly, right? They had to put effort, right? So they could earn money, they could feed their children. They had hand to mouth existence. They were working, they were doing livelihood. What is livelihood? They were engaged in livelihood to support their life. That is, they were doing odd jobs. They were doing odd jobs just so that they could afford food. Their living conditions, they never improved beyond food. No savings, no luxury houses, no comfort whatsoever. So on we worked, continuous work. Their lives were dictated by continuous work and waited for the light. Light means they waited, they were hopeful about a bright future, but that never happened. And went without the meat and cursed the bread. What they got to eat was, what did they get to eat? What they got to eat was cheap bread. Cheap, very cheap. Bread was the cheapest food they could find. Right? And went without meat. So they had to eat bread every day. When you eat something every day, it is like a curse. Right? You started hating what you eat. But they like to eat meat, but they could not afford meat. The same thing today, right? Their suffering is visible and material. So their suffering is very visible. The hardships of the townspeople, the working class people, they are visible. Visible to our plain eyes. And they are material. Cory's is invisible and internal. Now see, Richard Cory's problem and the townspeople's problem. Cory's problem, right? Let's come to Richard Cory's problem. Richard Cory's problem was internal. He was feeling sad inside. The townspeople's problem, That was external. They had no good food. That is poverty. So Richard Cory's problem was internal, meaning it is invisible. It is not visible to the human eye, invisible. But the townspeople's problems, they are visible to the human eye. They are external. So external problems, they are visible, but the internal problems, they are invisible. The thing is, rich guys, right? Rich people, right? Rich people, internal, the problems affecting rich people are often internal and invisible. But when it comes to poor people, their problems are material, external, and visible. So, the problems related to working class people are externally visible, but the problems affecting to upper class people, they are not externally visible, they are internal and they are invisible, right? We fail to catch their problems by observing from a plain sight. So their problems, our eyes don't meet their problems. Their suffering is visible and material. Cory's is invisible and internal. Robinson suggests that pain takes different forms. So pain can take different forms, and neither kind means type, right? And neither type announces itself plainly. So unless we pause and give attention, unless we take time to attentively observe each other's problems, it would be very difficult to understand their struggles, their problems, right? Because pain, it can take different forms. Pain never comes in one single universal form, right? Pain, right? The pain, it never manifests only inside. Sometimes it is external, sometimes it is internal, right? But according to the poem, the pain of upper class people is mostly associated with internal, right? Is the pain of upper class people is mostly attributed as internal and invisible. And when it comes to lower class people, working class townspeople, it is material. Material means they lack food. They lack food. That's basic needs. They lack basic needs, and that kind of suffering is externally visible. So with that understanding, we will conclude the poem. Let's go through the poem. Now it would be a piece of cake, analyzing the poem. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, the people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from soul to crown, clean favored and imperially slim. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, that is whenever means at any time Richard Cory would visit the town. So Richard Cory, he did not live in the town. So he did not live in the town. He was not part of this town. So whenever he visited the town, everyone looked at him as he was some superhuman or some alien. So something like that. Some exhibit, some monument, something worthy of attention. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, so he lived in a distance. He was not part of the town. That means he was not a ordinary person. That is, who are the townspeople? They are lower working class, poor people. But Richard Cory, he had his own land, He had his own house. He was a rich guy. We people on the pavement. So this is the townspeople, the voice of townspeople, right, narrating the story. We people on the so here pavement. That is one. Richard Cory is introduced as an upper class person, and pavement means the people, the bottom feeders, the people who are at the bottom of the society. Their social position is so low. They are described as, they describe themselves as living on the pavement. So they have to look up lower class people. We people on the pavement looked at him. So within the first two lines, within the first couple lines, we are introduced to social gap. There's a social disparity, upper class and lower class. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, from feet to head. Every inch of him was a gentleman. That is, we never ever have seen such a person, such a gentleman. That is hyperbole. Clean favored and imperially slim. So he was clean, favored. Everything related to him was very favorable, very impressive. Imperially slim. Imperial means he was like an emperor. He had the natural build, handsome features. So what they are describing here is that what the townspeople are trying to describe here is the townspeople are saying that Richard Cory, just by looking at him, they could say Richard Cory was born to a wealthy family, family of kings, a family of emperors. He, even his body structure announced that he was very rich. Imagine if you look at the palms, if you observe the palms of a working class person, you can observe all the blisters, all the bruises. Their right, the texture of their palm is very hard. But when it comes to the rich guys, they never do hard work. They never do manual labor. So their skin is very soft. And they never go under the sun. They are very fair. So there is some, right, we can justify that claim to a certain extent, right? And he was always quietly arrayed. That is how he wore. How he wore, meaning the clothes, right? How he always wore very modestly. He never wore too much flashy clothes. Why? Because he was by birth a rich guy. He had more than he needed. So he tried to remain, to dress himself in a very modest way. Modest way. Right? People who have lots of money, people who are born to very rich families, they don't want to dress, they don't want to announce that they are rich by wearing very expensive clothing, because they have nothing to prove. They are already rich. And he was always quietly arrayed. He was very modest when it comes to clothing. And he was always human when he talked. And he was always human when he talked. But there was something off. And when he talked, he talked like a human. The townspeople never expected him to talk like a human, because the townspeople, they idealized him. They looked at him as they were looking at a god or some superhuman or some alien, because they, according to them, Richard Cory was way far above their league, right? And he was always human. Now imagine how the poor people, the townspeople, they are thinking, if we are humans, right? Imagine we are humans and we don't have enough money. We don't have good education. We don't have good clothes. We don't have proper social polish. We are not socially refined. But that person, he has everything. If we are humans, how can he be a human? Because he has more things. Then he should be someone more than us. He should be a superhuman. He should be someone more than a human, like a god or something. And he was always human when he talked. The people, they never expected him to talk like a human when he talked. And he always, that is, the poet is leaving us a clue, an indication that even though Richard Cory had all those external perfections, he was a human. That is, imagine you feel sick, even I might feel sick, right? You feel pain, even I do the same, right? You feel hurt, I also get hurt. Likewise, we all humans are dictated by the same basic experiences and emotions. You celebrate your birthday, I celebrate my birthday, and Richard Cory celebrate his. Likewise, we are different. Every human, we are defined by the same basic human experiences and emotions, no matter to which religious category you belong, no matter which tradition or culture you represent. And he was always human when he talked. Now the poet is saying this is a human. So you should be looking at inside. But why are you looking at his outside? But still he fluttered pulses when he said. And still he fluttered pulses when he said. Now, a butterfly, it flutters its wings. Pulses means the heartbeat. Now, when Richard Cory would open his mouth and say good morning, the people who hear it, right, they would skip a heartbeat. Imagine you are a townsperson, you are a person from the town, and Richard Cory would greet you saying good morning. And when you would be greeted good morning by Richard Cory, your heart would skip a beat because you never expect someone like Richard Cory to talk to you, to pay attention even for a split second to you and to greet you and to talk to you. See, they think that is very rare. And he glittered when he walked. And they are describing when he is walking, according to townspeople, he is shining. He is radiating. He is like the sun. The sun, when it is shining, can you look at the sun directly? No, can't. So this is, he's not the, according to the townspeople, they are not describing him like an ordinary human. They are failing to recognize and connect with him, to identify. They are failing to identify him and to connect with him as a human being. Without here, without connecting with Richard Cory at a human level, they are just idealizing him in sensational language. In they are romanticizing, right? They are describing Richard Cory in hyperbolic language according to their envy, right? These are the last two quatrains. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king. And he was rich. First we get the statement, right? And next, what is happening here? Repetition. Yes, richer than a king. First we get the proposal and next we get the confirmation. First, The statement is saying he was rich, and next it is confirming that he was richer than a king. Now, who is richer than a king? He might be like an emperor. Once again, Richard Cory is not being described like a human being, like an ordinary human being in a factual sense. He is being painted using hyperbolic language. Hyperbolic language. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. He had an ounce of social refinement or social polish. In fine, we thought that he was everything. He, so the townspeople, they thought Richard Cory had everything to make us wish that we were in his place. So they were they were pretty envious about Richard Cory's wealth and social position. They wanted to be like Richard Cory. They wanted Richard Cory's wealth for themselves. They wanted Richard Cory's social position for themselves. They wanted to fit into Richard Cory's shoes. They wanted the lifestyle of Richard Cory. They wanted to live Richard Cory's lifestyle for themselves. Right? Why? Because these people, their lives are dictated by hardships. Right? They don't have food, enough food. They cannot even afford good food. They can only afford cheap food. Cheap, very, very cheap food. Not that much tasty, not that much nutritious. But Richard Cory, if he opens his freezer, the refrigerator, he would have everything. Right? He had everything. Everything. All food that is known and unknown to man. He was that rich. So on we worked and waited for the light. So the days of, the lives of townspeople, it never changed, and waited for the light. They are hopeful. The townspeople are hopeful that their lives might change one day for the better, but it never happened. So they are tolerating their lives. Their life is full of hardship. Their life is full of hardships, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. They can only afford cheap food, very, very cheap food, because they don't have enough money. They can only afford cheap food like bread, and went without the meat. Now, what is meat? Meat is very expensive. So they never get to eat meat because they don't have enough money to buy meat. And Richard Cory, so this is the living condition of townspeople. And while things were like this, and Richard Cory, one summer night, everything was calm. Calm means settled, very peaceful, very relaxing, right? Very relaxing, nothing ominous, nothing troubling, nothing to suggest something bad would happen. Everything was perfectly going well. That is, everything externally was okay, peaceful, fine, absolute. Everything was absolutely fine. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home. He went home. After, right, he would come to the town and he would return home as usual. So people thought another perfect day for Richard Cory, and another, right, painful day for us. But Richard Cory went home and put a bullet through his head. And put a bullet through his head. So what happened? Richard Cory committed suicide. He took his own life. So why did the poet why did the poet waited to include the plot twist or the reversal at the final line? Because the poet wanted us to make the same mistake as the townspeople did, right? I think even you might have fallen for the same trick, right? Why? Because we are so much used to looking at the outside, outward appearance of a person and judging how he would feel inside. So the poet wanted to teach us a lesson, wanted to teach us a lesson. Just because everything outside is going perfectly fine with some person, it doesn't mean everything is going fine inside. He is happy with his life. He has no problems inside. Even though, right, people might look extraordinary outside, they might be bearing invisible internal pain. They might be carrying invisible internal emotional weight and pain inside. That is unbearable. And when that pain become unbearable, when Richard Cory felt that pain was too much that he could not handle or release, he didn't know what to do, right? He didn't know what to do. He took his gun and put a bullet through his head. That is, he committed suicide. So no one is going to justify his action that he did the right thing. No, it is very bad, right? It's not the right thing. But the poem is trying to make us sensitive to another person's inner feelings, because we never, right, we are so good at describing how a person looks outside, but we never give time to understand his feelings. Why? Feelings are buried inside. Feelings we never recognize. We as humans, right, we are never good at understanding feelings. We are only good at labeling outward appearances. He is wealthy, he is rich, he has this sort of money, right, he is into this business, likewise, right, he comes from this sort of a family background, right. This is the caste he belongs to. So the message is, right, pain, pain, certain types of pain, right, pain can manifest in the form, in an external form, but mostly when it is internal, it is invisible, invisible. So the poet is trying to, once again, to make us sensitive toward the feelings and the pains of other individuals. We should connect with another person at a personal level without making outward remarks based on outward appearances. So that was all about Sir Edward Arlington Robinson's poem Richard Cory. So I would be bidding you good night now, for we have been studying the poem for like 2 hours and 20 minutes. Okay, with that I will be concluding. Good night.